How's it going, guys? My name's Shane. Welcome back to the Horror Basement, and today we're going to be talking about the Poughkeepsie Tapes, which is a 2007 horror mockumentary which follows Ed, aka the Water Street Butcher. Now, just to clarify, before I get into my thoughts on the movie, this is a fictional story. It is a mockumentary, despite being essentially filmed in the style of a true crime documentary like you would see on Discovery ID or the A&E network. Uh, so Ed is a serial killer who was active for a stretch of many years in Poughkeepsie, New York. He starts out. We're not given any backstory or reason why Ed begins his killing spree, but he starts by essentially randomly abducting people off the street. His first victim, presumably, is a little girl who he snatches up right from her front yard. And his next victim is a couple that picks him up hitchhiking before he hits the driver over the head, causing the car to crash. Now, Ed also mutilates the bodies of his victims, and all of this is caught on camera because during the entire process of abducting, killing, and mutilating all of his victims, Ed is filming it all with a handheld camcorder, and the camcorder bits are the horror portion of the movie because towards the end, all his cachet of home movies, if you will, are found, and they're interspersed throughout the film. Now, after his first three victims, which show a kind of disorganized MO, where he's, driving around, walking around, shoving a camcorder in people's faces, and then snatching them without any real forethought or the kind of stalking and pre-planning you would see in an organized serial killer. Ed abducts a high school student named Cheryl, who he then keeps as a sex slave for the duration of the movie. And this is the part where if you have a weak stomach or you're not a big fan of extreme violence, that kind of thing, I might recommend skipping this one, just because all of the horror bits, the Poughkeepsie Tapes, as the title would have you, as in the title, they're all shot in the style of basically a snuff film, to where Cheryl is getting, physically and verbally abused, beaten on, all that kind of stuff, and it's very graphic in the frankness and the realisticness of which it's shown. And then as the bodies continue to pile up and both the local police and the FBI get involved in the investigation, Ed goes and changes his MO, his modus operandi again, and starts using the old, a similar trick that Ted Bundy and Ed Kemper would use. He starts impersonating a police officer and switches from random people to only going after sex workers. And this continues until eventually, until after Ed has essentially avoided capture for multiple years and completely bamboozled and duped the FBI at every turn. His house is eventually raided, where the FBI finds the Poughkeepsie Tapes and finds Cheryl, who has been living as the slave of Ed for, years. But they do not actually find Ed himself. He has skipped town, and just to add insult to injury, after Cheryl kills herself from suffering years and years of abuse and then turning it all the way around into Stockholm Syndrome. She commits suicide, and Ed comes back to steal her corpse and leave one last tape behind. Now, my problem with this movie is not, as I mentioned previously, the violence, the gore, or any of that stuff, or even the fact that it's shot in the style of a documentary as opposed to a traditional film narrative with like the narrative flowing through a 3-act structure. My issue is the character of Ed himself. Ed is shown to go from being a disorganized killer that is primarily focused on killing random people so that he can mutilate and basically make art projects out of their bodies. And then he abducts this girl and to keep as a sex slave, which those two things kind of don't jive. And by the way, on top of horror movies, I'm kind of a true crime nerd as well, so you just have to humor me here while I wax philosophic on this. But the mutilating of the corpses, which is shown throughout Ed's killing spree, would be the focus of his like sexual energy. Like that's what would get him off, for lack of a better word. So why he would then switch to keeping this girl alive for years and years to keep as a plaything, essentially, that doesn't make sense. And then moving forward to entirely change his MO and go from being disorganized to being highly organized, where you have this this ruse or this scheme set in place to make it easier for you to be inconspicuous, and switching to going after sex workers to get the heat off you, essentially. Most serial killers in a realistic or a real life scenario wouldn't be able to up and change their MO 3 times because they wouldn't really be in control of their actions to that degree. And also, he does this in, while walking and driving around, shoving a camcorder in people's faces, and yet, with all the FBI working on it, he evades capture for a number of years, and is still uncaught by the end of the movie. So we don't get any real resolution as to... We never learn his backstory, we never get to see him interviewed after the fact, so the movie really ends essentially unresolved. Now, there could be essentially 2 reasons for this from a filmmaking perspective. The first would be that the lack of resolution to the story is meant to underpin the senselessness of real-world violence, but that kind of falls flat when you look at what I've said already, how unrealistic the killer is when compared to real-life serial killers. And the second would be that the filmmaker wanted to make this character of the Water Street Butcher, or Ed, essentially invincible and omnipotent to make a more compelling narrative for the story. But that also falls flat because the story is never given a concrete narrative. Things basically just happen, and we're given no resolution at the end. So that's basically my thoughts on this movie. Overall, it was an interesting watch, and despite these problems, I would recommend it if you have the stomach for it to give it a watch, because it's kind of interesting seeing a horror movie being made in the style of the A&E documentaries. Yes, overall, I suppose I would recommend this one, but at the same time, I was yelling at the screen about these things that didn't make sense, so I had to come down and make a video about it. But that's going to be it for today's video. If you liked, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, join the Basement Army, leave a comment below if you have any other movies you'd like me to review, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you.